Was Battle for Azeroth really as bad as people remember? This is one of the few expansions that was universally hated for a ton of reasons. However, I think most of these reasons might be a little bit overblown, and I can kind of explain why people hated Battle for Azeroth so much in one short, simple term: Azerite armor. Azerite armor, as a mechanic, was so bad, it pretty much shaped the terrible first impressions of the expansion from the get-go.
And in the aftermath of the Legion's attack, our world is actually direly wounded. And Magni, speaker for Azeroth, speaker for her world soul, will reach out to us as some of her greatest champions and summon us, where we will commune with the world soul at the very beginning of our journey, and we will receive a gift from Azeroth herself. An artifact-quality medallion called the Heart of Azeroth. Now, unlike the artifact weapons that you wielded in Legion, this artifact isn't something you're going to customize, doesn't have a huge trait tree to it, but what it does do is it serves as an incredibly potent power source that will unlock latent properties in many of the pieces of armor that you're going to come across and acquire throughout your journeys. So this is some early UI concept art for how this might play out. Here you see a helmet, and these concentric circles each reflect tiers of powers, where you can choose one tier from each ring, one power from each ring. And your ability to access these tiers, to unlock them, will depend on how strong your amulet is. A stronger helmet will require more levels in your amulet to equip, to access. But basically, when we looked at the artifact system, there were a lot of elements of progression that worked very well. There were others, such as making hard choices between empowering one specs weapon versus another, that weren't so great. Or lots of the inventory clutter, things like that. We're looking to improve a lot of the aspects of the system. We also want to give ongoing options for choice and customization, rather than the artifact weapon system where you made tons of choices back in September when you were first filling out the tree, but it's been largely linear progression since then. In this world, each piece of armor, in a handful of slots that we select, we currently have 3 in mind, will offer a potential for customization and choice in a handcrafted way. These are not random traits, unlike the Netherlight Crucible. A helm is a helm is a helm, and you can pick what you want to suit your playstyle, to suit your needs as you progress through the world.
Azerite armor was supposed to replace pretty much all of the fun new gear progression systems we had in the past. It was a series of 3 pieces of armor that you would have 2 rings, which would give you bonuses to your main spec, depending on its traits that you could find on these pieces of armor. And if you had a proper level in your necklace, which was just a pure stat stick, you'd be able to unlock all the rows in order to fully be able to use your armor. And being able to actually farm out all these rows actually required a pretty high neck level. So you had to do a lot of grinding in game in order to be able to use your pieces of equipment. Now, on surface level, this doesn't really seem like that big of a deal. The only reason this was controversial was because of the drastic level of power differences it had from the previous expansion. In the previous expansion, you had artifact weapons, 2 legendaries, and tier set bonuses. And the artifact weapon had more traits on it by itself than all 3 of your Azerite pieces combined, especially when you count in the upgrades you got throughout the expansion, like the Netherlight Crucible. On top of that, you also had the legendaries, which provided additional huge power increases, where many classes and specs were balanced around their strongest legendary. And you also had tier set bonuses, which everybody who plays the game should know adds an extra layer of power to your character. In comparison, the Azerite armor was like being able to pick what your tier set bonuses were. However, it was kind of worse in a respect, because sometimes the tier set bonuses were really good, and most of the time the 4 set bonus could be absolutely amazing for certain classes. But the way the Azerite armor worked made it so they couldn't really make any of the traits as good as a proper tier set bonus, because all the traits had to be made with the intention that they could be stacked. It was possible to have 3 of the same traits amongst all your 3 pieces of equipment, so you couldn't really do something that changed your spec too drastically, because it had to do something that could be stacked on top of itself. Now, despite this, there were a couple of Azerite traits where you only took it once because there was a specific trait that did not stack, like increasing the duration of atonement by 2 seconds, but for the most part, they were made with the intention of getting to stack with each other. So they generally just provided some kind of number increase to one of your abilities. And because of this design choice, a lot of them were kind of boring. Some of the best tier set bonuses could drastically change how you played your class. Legendaries from Legion could completely warp your rotation around them, and the artifact weapons themselves give you brand new abilities to push, with a couple of other extra abilities that would grant you sometimes, and a ton of passives that just made you stronger in other areas. So in comparison of having Azerite armor, which gave you boring abilities, replacing all this fun stuff you used to have, and was meant to be the only thing you had for the entire expansion, it's no wonder the system was pretty much panned from the very beginning. There was massive amounts of feedback to change azerite armor to just really anything else, and Blizzard's response was just to basically ignore most of that feedback. When the expansion launched and the entire player base finally got to try out azerite armor for themselves that all the streamers were complaining about in the beta, they too got to see firsthand just how much of a mess it was. What azerite armor could have been was a system about picking your own tier set bonuses. It was actually kind of hard to get azerite pieces in the first place. And the azerite armor you got would only give you an option of 2, maybe 3 traits to pick for your major abilities, because each azerite piece shared all of its traits amongst all of your specs, so you basically got to choose if you wanted the generic trait for the azerite piece or your spec specific trait. And if the piece of gear you had didn't have your particular spec specific trait, then you had to find a completely new piece of gear that might have it. However, azerite armor gets even worse, because if you did have a piece of gear that had the trait you wanted, and you got a higher item level piece of that azerite gear, there's a good chance you wouldn't be able to use it because of your azerite necklace level system. The higher the item level of the azerite gear, the more levels you need on your azerite necklace in order to use all of those traits. Even if it was the exact same piece of equipment, just a higher item level, you wouldn't be able to use all the traits on that piece of equipment that you previously had been using with no problem, because there was just an arbitrary lock in having to grind out your necklace levels in order to use your gear. So it was an entirely common scenario for people to not be able to use their new pieces of equipment, using lower level pieces of azerite armor, simply because they couldn't use the actual traits on their new armor yet. And it gets even worse, because the traits would not reset if you change your spec. So you needed different azerite armor for all of your different specs. And resetting the traits in order to change them to a different spec was not free, and in fact incredibly expensive if you did it too often within a short amount of time, which was just a mind-boggling decision by most players, as why would they gate it so hard when you only had 2 options to pick from anyway? It's almost like Blizzard was just incredibly afraid of the power they gave players in the previous expansion that they dialed it back way too much with azerite armor, and were completely shocked when they found that people didn't like how weak they were, and how many arbitrary restrictions they had for seemingly no reason. And as further proof of how bad this was, Blizzard basically abandoned the mechanic entirely after the first major patch, where you still had azerite armor for the rest of the expansion, but they made it so much easier to deal with, you could basically ignore it to an extent. They made azerite armor a lot easier to obtain, they created a currency that allowed you to actually target specific pieces you needed, they gave you an extra row of traits, and made it so it was almost impossible to not have the highest level necklace to use all of your pieces of azerite armor immediately, but still made it expensive to reforge for no reason. However, even though Blizzard made it a lot easier to deal with azerite armor, it was still in the game and still wasn't all that fun, which was a major problem because World of Warcraft players love their gear more than anything. There are some players who don't even care about raids or dungeons, and simply do them because they just want gear. There are whole secondary markets of people paying massive amounts of gold to get carry through the highest level of content just so they can get better gear. So if Blizzard is going to mess up a feature, they definitely don't want to mess up the gear. And if anything, Battle for Azeroth proves why you should never make that mistake again, because if it wasn't for the massive failure of azerite armor, people probably would have liked BFA a lot more. Because in this same expansion we got azerite armor, we also had one of the best additions to the game in the form of the Essence system, which was created as a direct response to how bad azerite armor was, and created a whole system of extra abilities you could choose from that could meaningfully change your gameplay, with extra passives you could pick, which could also be changed in any rest area without having to pay a whole bunch of money, and without taking away from your other pre-established pieces of armor, as it was just built inside your necklace, which wasn't doing anything anyway. You could pick an active ability that gave you an extra AoE, extra single target, extra raid healing cooldown, extra defensives, or just big damage against mobs in the open world. There were a lot of different active abilities you could choose from that you could change depending on what kind of content you were doing. I know I loved the Breath of the Dying essence, since it could let you chain one-shot mobs while doing dailies if the damage was high enough to kill the target. And also I loved the Well of Existence passive, since it stored all of my overhealing and turned it into extra healing when needed, which was nice on a class that was built towards massive amounts of overhealing. And then there was Essence of the Focusing Iris, which I don't think was really BIS for any class, but was easily one of the coolest looking actives they've added to the game, since it's basically just a giant Kamehameha. Not only was all this a great response to azerite armor being bad, it was one of the best borrowed power systems ever added. If we were to compare all of the borrowed power mechanics added in modern WoW, I can't think of anything that could topple the essences. It's almost crazy how overshadowed they were, but to be fair, they weren't perfect either. Blizzard was hell-bent on giving people random grinds during this time period, and made getting the tier 3 abilities require a bit of legwork to accomplish, and did not make them account-wide, so it made grinding them out on alt an unnecessary pain. Although, to add on to that, they did have this unique mechanic where you can grind even further to get a cosmetic upgrade tier 4 of the abilities, which did not increase its power but did make them look a lot cooler. If anything, it'd be great if they had more grinds to get cooler looking versions of your default spells. This particular extra grind for cosmetic spells is one I'm sure everyone can get behind. This was just an excellent mechanic the BFA had, which isn't the only thing that BFA excelled in, because BFA also had one of the best raids the game ever introduced, the Battle for Dazar'alor. BFA was a full expansion with 4 raid tiers across 5 different raids. You had Old Deer as the intro raid, Battle for Dazar'alor and Crucible Storms for Tier 2, Eternal Palace for Tier 3, and finally Ny'alotha for the final raid of the expansion. And while the other raids were fine, Battle for Dazar'alor was easily the best of all of them. In fact, I'd say Battle for Dazar'alor is a top 5 raid. Out of the 29 different raid tiers, I think it's up there alongside Old War or ICC. Let's set the stage for Battle for Dazar'alor. The entire expansion was sold as a faction conflict, and there were a ton of quests on both sides in order to set up this eventual raid. As the Horde, you hear the Alliance is attacking far in the north, and they sent a huge army that you have to go stop. So you help fight with the Zandalare forces through the Alliance forces, cutting your way through these desperate soldiers until you finally meet the gigantic navy at the shore, only to find out that it was all an illusion. The soldiers you were fighting were just sent there to die in order to sell the fact that they might have a giant army there waiting. But actually, they were in the middle of sieging the capital that very moment, so you had to run all the way back as quickly as possible only to find the city already being attacked. Then when you get inside, you find that King Rastakhan has already been killed. And the only thing you can do is learn about how it happened through someone retelling the story, and then chase after Jaina out in the open seas. And it had an amazing mechanic of actually changing your race to the opposite faction so you could be better immersed in the story, while also changing the dialogues that the NPC said for both sides in order to better sell how some sides tell the stories differently. The Horde would change into Alliance in order to play the story of attacking the capital, and the Alliance would turn into the Horde in order to play the part of the Horde going after Jaina afterwards. And then it all culminates in a final battle out in the open sea. You chase Jaina out into the sea where she turns around and just freezes everything in place. And what happens next is just an amazing boss fight. I still remember when I heard about Dragon Soul back in Cataclysm, and how it was a very thematic raid with all of its boss fights. You would go to the top of a tower, jump on a gunship to chase after Deathwing, parachute onto his back, and then finally beat him into the middle of the Maelstrom. And while all of this sounded cool in theory, when you actually did it, you had some of the worst fights ever made. The gunship battle, which you were chasing after Deathwing on, was one of the most bug-filled fights I've ever had the displeasure of doing. The spine of Deathwing is just one of the most hated fights ever made, and the final fight is one of the most disappointing final bosses ever, which is still kind of used as a benchmark to compare other disappointing final bosses to. They just really did not nail the thematic nature of the bosses, because they tried too much to make them thematic, and not enough to make them an actual good boss fight. So, when I first heard about the Jaina fight being another thematic boss fight, I was kind of skeptical, which probably made me like the fight even more when I felt that they totally nailed it. The fight starts off on a boat where you're fighting Jaina and her marines. You can DPS down the marines like normal, or you can have your priest mind control them and have them jump off the boat, which I thought was a really neat mechanic to add to a boss fight, because generally they don't let you do things like that in boss fights, even though it totally makes sense from a thematic point of view. At any point that you're fighting Jaina, if your group tries to bloodless, Jaina will actually ice block for the duration of it, like a smart character would do that knows their enemy's tactics. So you'd have to wait for the opportune moment of the fight in order to pop bloodless in order to fight other things that weren't Jaina or to interrupt mechanics. When Jaina freezes the boat in the ocean and runs to the middle, and you have to chase after her, you're constantly getting stacks of a frostbite debuff, which makes sense because you're fighting on a gigantic slab of ice created by an enemy. And you have to warm yourself by going to flame barrels, which also makes sense because you were just on a boat earlier that would realistically have those nearby. When Jaina gets too much to handle and tries to freeze everyone, you have to run back to the boat in order to free a major NPC who can help you deal with Jaina's instant kill attacks. And in the final phase of the fight, you're just trying to burn her down before everybody freezes to death, where she ice blocks and teleports away at the end. I'm still not really sure how they nailed it, but I can't remember the last time I've had so much fun progressing on a boss fight, because it was full of a whole bunch of multiple layers that had you moving all over the place and doing a lot of unique things where you were basically just fighting an ice mate. And also it helped that it wasn't overly long, which is usually the case for mid-expansion final boss fights and not the final ones. So if anything, the fact that it was the second raid of the expansion probably worked in its favor of not making the fight too long to overstay its welcome, and be exactly the right length to be a masterpiece of a boss fight. And in fact, to this day, the Jaina final fight is my personal favorite boss fight. The rest of the raid was also excellent, with a mini final boss in the middle where you're fighting King Rastakhan, who is obviously not as hard as Jaina, but fitting for a major lore character when you're defeating it. Now, obviously, one raid doesn't make an entire expansion, but it's really hard to state just how good Battle for Dazar'alor was. After the raid, we had Mechagon and Nazjatar, two brand new max level zones to explore, full of treasures and rares and certain mechanics. On Mechagon, you had a really good trinket that you could modify by putting gems inside of it in order to have the effects that you wanted. The best effect was a laser that did so much damage that it was nerfed multiple times, and for a while was one of the best legacy trinkets you could use in time-walking content. The laser beam is easily one of the most overpowered trinket effects ever made. Over in Nazjatar, you had a gigantic zone full of all kinds of hidden treasures to find. like a secret quest chain where you to go around and trade all kinds of different items and different NPCs in order to unlock a mount. Plus, they had scheduled PvP events in the zone and just a ton of things to grind out if you wanted 100% all the achievements and collectibles. And back in Mechagon, there were these little workstations around the zone which could give you a zone buff that can help you kill things quicker or just get around faster, as well as unlocking the collectibles from all the hidden quests, rares, and events. And yes, there were hidden quests in the zone, which was a really unique thing for modern WoW because they don't really make hidden quests anymore. In order to 100% the zone, you had to find out how to get these hidden quests, which could actually take a while because you did need to do a bunch of specific things in order to unlock them. And if you weren't a collector and didn't care about all this hidden stuff, the actual power upgrades you got from the zone were pretty straightforward and required minimal effort to get the full benefits of them. If anything, I'm kind of sad they don't do this more often. In fact, I don't think they've ever done this again. In Shadowlands, they had a max level zone for all 3 major patches. You had the Maw, Korthia, and Zereth Mortis. In Legion, they did have Argus as a gigantic zone you unlocked at the end of the expansion. But, to be honest, it was just a glorified world quest zone. The fact that Nazjatar and Mechagon were unique in their mechanics and very separate from each other just made the max level zones so much more fun to play in during the expansion. If you got bored of Mechagon, you could just hop over to Nazjatar and start doing dailies there. And it was just a completely different feel because of how differently the mechanics of the zones functioned. In Argus, even though you did have 3 different zones, they all had the exact same zone mechanic, so it was basically like 3 different sceneries on top of the same thing. They tried something new with Mechagon and Nazjatar, and the community largely loved it. It's kind of hard to explain just how negative the community perception of the game was at the time. However, even in this incredibly hostile environment of BFA hate, people agreed that these 2 new zones were fun and they really liked the idea of having both of them to play at the same time. If they only just added one or the other at a time, probably people wouldn't like them very much, but the fact they added them both at the same time was what made it a huge W for Battle for Azeroth. Which is a shame that all of these great things are just overshadowed by azerite armor. Azerite armor is just the black stain on the expansion. It was only really terrible for the very beginning, but has kind of painted the legacy, the branding of Battle for Azeroth. Or is it really fair to just blame everything on a failed gearing system? I'd argue the gearing system is just as important as I said it was early in the video, but there also was a lot of other incredibly mediocre things about the expansion, which definitely added fuel to the arguments against it. While the battle for Dazar'alor, essences, the dual inclusion of Mechagon and Nazjatar were well liked, there were plenty of other things added to expansion that were deservedly also just bad and not well liked. Namely, the island expeditions and the Warfronts. Island expeditions were sold as an exploratory thing where you go to an island, search for treasures, and fight enemy faction who's trying to stop you from doing this. What ended up being was an AoE grindfest, where you just go around and gather as many mobs as possible and then AoE them down, in order to finish as quickly as you could. Because island expeditions were one of the best ways to grind out your necklace level, and many hardcore players hated them by the end of the expansion for just how many they had to do. Warfronts were sold as a Warcraft 3 style mode, where you could collectively choose which minions and bases to build in order to eventually push into the enemy keep. What it actually ended up being was an AFK simulator, where it was so hard to lose that there wasn't really a big incentive to try, other than maybe winning a little bit earlier. Because even if you did try as hard as you couldn't actually win that quickly because there was built-in timers restricting you from how fast you could accomplish things. And these 2 features were some of the main selling points of the expansion. Island expeditions were supposed to be a brand new mode that would have you exploring all these new locations and getting treasures, and while it was full of collectibles, they were not fun at all to do. And Warfronts were just kinda boring, where the best way to do them was just to put on a good Netflix show on your second monitor and just kinda mindlessly kill things and collect wood and minerals for when the game would eventually let you push the enemy keep. It was so bad that they never added the Barons or Silvermoon Warfronts they had in the game files, and never tried a PvP mode like they said they might. And on the flip side, the only good thing that BFA had were its raiding content, Mythic Plus, Essence system, the dual inclusion of Mechagon and Nazjatar, and the allied races. Although let me rewind a little bit on this. During BFA, Blizzard tried to iterate on the Mythic Plus system they'd introduced in the previous expansion, where they introduced seasonal affixes that would be applied to Mythic Plus dungeons of levels 10 and higher, and they were actually a big success. The affix of the final tier BFA had this mechanic where you would fight these minions of the old gods at points throughout the dungeon, and where they died in the other realm would spawn a portal that would take you back to the dungeon. And you could use these portals in the other realm in order to skip mobs, which was an amazing design choice because, at the time, a key meta in Mythic Plus dungeons was how to properly skip mob packs. Because a lot of the times in high-level Mythic Plus dungeons, the trash mobs were more dangerous than the actual bosses themselves, and you would strategically skip ones that were too hard or just not worth the effort, and only deal with the weakest ones that could fill the meter in order to complete the dungeon. And the meta at the time was just to have a bunch of rogues in order to skip those packs, to the point where there was a lot of contention in the pugging Mythic Plus dungeon community, where it almost felt like you were required to have at least one rogue so you could skip certain mob packs. And this entire thing was completely solved with this affix, that just lets you skip whatever you wanted, just as long as you position the portals where you thought they would be best. It was such a successful mechanic that I'm sure many people are sad they didn't bring it back further for any other seasonal fixes, or just added it as a default mechanic in Mythic Plus dungeons. However, modern Mythic Plus dungeons make it a lot easier to skip mod packs you don't want to do, or just make it so skipping isn't really possible anymore. So I guess they solved it in one way or another. But the addition of these seasonal affixes were an absolute W for the expansion, and were tied to an incredibly important mode for the expansion as one of the 3 pillars of endgame content. And we still have these seasonal affixes to this day. And then of course we have the allied races, where Blizzard just kinda doubled the available races that players could use during this expansion. They had to create a whole new tab just to hold all the new races they gave you, where they didn't give you another new race until Dragonflight, where you just got a single new race. Now, a lot of the races were basically just slightly different colored versions of previous races we had before, but it doesn't really matter when it comes to getting brand new racials to pick from. My current main is one of these allied races that was added in BFA, and it's because a lot of the new racials were just so much more interesting than the older ones. I love that Dazar'alor trolls get to pick which minor bonus you have, and you get to change it out once a week to be something else. So really, BFA seems kind of stacked with really good things. It had a masterpiece of a raid, it introduced a long-lasting mechanic to the Mythic Plus system that players actually liked, it had a whole bunch of new races to play with, which had the unintended side effects of filling the old world with people leveling these new races, it had excellent max level zone ideas, it did have an excellent endgame system with the essences. So why exactly does azerite armor, boring islands, and Warfronts overshadow all this other stuff? Well, because the gear problems don't end with azerite. I didn't even talk about Titanforging or corruptions yet. Titanforging was a mechanic not added in BFA, but it was definitely ended in BFA, where whenever you got a new piece of equipment, there was a chance that it would just be a higher item level than normal. And there was a chance it would be an incredibly higher item level than normal if it Titanforged. The very possibility that an item could Titanforge meant that there was always the incentive to do max level content, because you never could have a full set of Titanforge gear. So you never could have the best possible gear in the game at the time. It literally just added a random layer of gambling to your gearing system, where if your gear didn't have some kind of Warforge or Titanforge proc on it, it was kind of a disappointment to just get a normal piece of gear. And while it was fun to get a Titanforge piece of gear, it caused all kinds of contempt in the community because people did not like the fact that their gear progression was tied behind a random mechanic they had no control over. So eventually Blizzard did remove it, but it was in the expansion for at least half of its lifetime. And then it was replaced with corruptions. Now, corruptions were a mechanic that would have a piece of gear with a huge benefit attached to them, where they could do things like increase your haste, lower the cooldowns in your abilities, or just have a proc that simply did extra damage to whatever you're attacking. And pieces of equipment could have random corruption on it whenever you got it, and corruptions had 3 different levels to them based on the kind of corruptions there were. So if you got a new pair of gloves, for example, there was a chance you could have a corruption on that piece of equipment. And there was a chance the corruption could be one of the corruptions you wanted, and then there was another chance the corruption could have a tier 3 corruption, which was the strongest of all of them and the most useful most of the time. So they removed Titanforging, a mechanic that people hated because it added an unnecessary level of RNG to your gear, in order to introduce an even bigger source of RNG on top of your gear. However, they did have ways to get specific corruptions, where you could just go to a vendor and just buy the corruption you wanted and just enchant them to your non-corrupted piece of gear like you would an enchant. And this totally would have solved all of the major problems with the corruption system, if it wasn't for the fact that the corruptions were on a rotating vendor, where you would have to wait a couple of weeks to be able to buy the corruption you actually needed. And the system was not introduced at the launch of the patch that introduced corruptions, so by the time you could buy the ones you wanted, you were probably done with progression if you were a hardcore player. And the corruptions also worked in PvP, so it created a balancing nightmare. However, even with all of these negative things about corruptions, the corruptions themselves were really strong. Like, insanely strong. Like, a full set of your best corruptions made you stronger than you were in Legion strong. You could lower your cooldowns on major abilities to be able to spam them. You could also have so much haste that you were melting people in less than 10 seconds in PvP. You could have so many layers of Twilight Devastation with stamina gear on that you could literally one-shot your enemy team as a tank in arena matches. The corruptions were absolutely bonkers, and that's what I loved about them. They were not balanced at all. Hardcore players hated corruptions because of how bad they made the game for them. But for us average players, being able to one-shot groups of enemies with a perfectly timed proc of Twilight Devastation was awesome. Being able to go out and collect a whole bunch of different kinds of equipments with different corruptions in order to just try out different builds was tons of fun. And also the amount of grinding that was required to get a hold of all these new pieces of gear with different corruptions definitely tickled all the parts of my brain that loves to play MMOs and grind for power increases. I loved corruptions. I loved how unbalanced they were. I loved how much grinding was required to get the ones you wanted. I loved how they worked in all types of content you did. I loved how they made getting Keystone Master a breeze during the final tier of the expansion. And I also loved they were only in the game for that one tier and did not carry over into any other expansions. If anything, I think corruptions succeeded specifically because they were temporary. They were an excellent power imbalance created specifically because they wanted to cause a power imbalance, and because it would be the final rate of the expansion that nobody liked. So it was the perfect time to try something stupid like corruptions, and it was a masterpiece in being broken. I applaud Blizzard for trying corruptions. They were so bad. None of the streamers or YouTubers praised them for being good, and if anyone did, they'd be rightly mocked for it because they weren't good. And that's what was so great about them. Sometimes it's fun to just have an imbalanced mess, and it's another aspect of this expansion that kinda gets overlooked because of just how bad they were on paper. Objectively speaking, corruptions were not good for the game. They were absolutely terrible. But they were so much fun nonetheless. And if anything, I wanted to see Blizzard try something like this again in different expansions. Although most of the time they never go as far as they do with corruptions and power level, and are too conservative with what kinds of crazy powers they let you get from a borrowed power mechanic. So, BFA in review. It had one of the worst gear-in issues of any expansion, but also had great leveling incentives, one of the best raids, fun mechanics, although unbalanced. Part of their fun was their unbalanced nature, and tons of content to do in comparison to many other expansions. After all, we weren't missing an entire raid tier like in Worlds Draenor or Shadowlands, and even had a mini raid after Battle for Dazar'alor. Was BFA as bad as people remember? In some ways, yes, because it was so bad Blizzard was free to try stupid things, and it led to tons of fun, making it a blast for people who got to enjoy it.